herzlichen Dank für die Einladung zu dieser, finde ich, wichtigen Konferenz. Nachdem ich die Teilnehmerzusammensetzung gesehen habe, habe ich mich entschlossen, den Vortrag auf Englisch zu schreiben. Jetzt nur einige Bemerkungen vorher noch auf Deutsch. Also es ist schwierig, nach Mark Kramer zu sprechen, das muss ich sagen. Und was ich anbiete, ist ein Mosaikstein sowjetischer Perspektiven, aber nicht militärischer, sondern eben diplomatischer. Wo ich hier genau hineingehöre. In dem Call for Papers war eine Frage, welche Entscheidungen haben zu dem Truppenabzug geführt. Und ich würde sagen, dass ich da auch noch nicht das bedienen kann, aber ich kann sozusagen einen Ausschnitt eines Bodensatzes an Stimmungslagen anbieten, eigentlich auch ähnlich wie die Stimmung, die hier von militärischer Seite geäußert haben, die in diesem Kontext eben zum Vorschein kamen. Und auch nicht bis 1999, muss ich sagen, wie es im Programm steht, sondern eher wende ich den Blick nochmal zurück bis 1987. Dass ich keine Präsentation habe, entspricht auch der Tatsache, dass die Akten, mit denen ich gearbeitet habe, jetzt leider nicht gerade freigegeben wurden, sondern jetzt auf lange Sicht überhaupt unzugänglich sein werden und auch sowieso alle handschriftlich abgeschrieben werden mussten. Deswegen trage ich halt jetzt hier auch vor und stelle jetzt auf Englisch. An internal diplomatic briefing of 29th of March 1991 from the Soviet Embassy, now department only at the Linie in Berlin, was titled On Soviet Interests in Germany. It was written by the embassy's first secretary, with one copy also sent to the Academy of Sciences. It began with a preamble or prologue in which the current situation was assessed. Quote, considering the topic of the realization of Soviet interests in Germany and more broadly through cooperation with Germany in Europe, it is necessary to highlight three principal factors, in our opinion, which to a decisive degree already determine and will determine these interests in the future. Firstly, above all, we are talking about the acceleration of crisis processes in all spheres of life in Soviet society, and especially in the material. In many sectors of the national economy, the critical situation has reached such a depth that it is becoming quite clear we cannot get out of it on our own, not without help. Secondly, with the collapse of the structures of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance and the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the Soviet Union no longer has any allies in Central Europe with unequivocally expressed common interests in the field of foreign and security policies. In domestic politics, too, it is now difficult to find those who feel politically and ideologically connected to the USSR. Disintegration processes in the former socialist friendship lead to a weakening of economic ties, and the Soviet Union can count less and less on these countries to solve its economic problems, especially as they themselves are going through a critical period in their economic development. Concrete and quite specific, I'm still quoting by the way, concrete and quite specific above all pro-American, or rather pro-NATO opinion forces in Europe who would not mind isolating the USSR from European political and economic integration processes are increasingly using the argument of, quote now within quote, the possible return of the USSR to a dictatorship, end of quote. They do not want to provide economic aid as long as there is no clear development towards the market. They are adding fuel to the fire of some of our top politicians who are talking about, again, quote within quote, attempts by the West to destabilize our economy, end of quote within quote, about which has expressed his strong disapproval in a very negative way, for example, the American ambassador. End of this lengthy quote here, now from this briefing. I stop the quotation here for one thing because I have to. My own archival notes from the Archive of Foreign Politics of the Russian Federation in Moscow say, pick up on here next time, but after 2019 there was no next time, so unfortunately the 10 pages of assessment of what was needed from Germany I do not have. But this prologue and then the following assessment of Germany is itself also the lowest point and gloomiest outlook that I came across in this type and selection of files. The aim of my presentation is therefore to look back and compare this assessment with earlier briefings of this kind in the GDR, Pasolstvo and Referentura collections, which is embassy and kind of encoding chamber or writing secretary chamber collections at this archive during the Perestroika period. I will not be able to present a seamless, continuous development, yet the approaches and moods presented in the other informatia or briefings that I saw provide an interpretable picture of how diplomatic actors on various, including the lower levels, communicated internally on the position of the USSR in the German brother state. The picture could be supplemented and broadened by other archival documents, such as internal press agency reports and instructions, which were also collected at the embassy. And one must say that these documents were also always circulated between higher agencies. Komsomol reports that were also circulated in connection with the embassy. But since there will be no time here in this presentation, I will concentrate on these strictly foreign ministry files. This archival research was one part of my current project in which I study how and through which communication channels Perestroika, starting from its very early, still very Soviet state-imposed phase, was advertised as a viable model abroad, specifically in the GDR, and from state levels in state capitals into everyday life and also the provinces. So I'm interested in those actors on the lower levels in particular. The situation was, of course, I don't need to say this here, not easy. In the GDR, the leadership was quick in blocking the spread of reform, while the Soviet side, accustomed to hegemony and asymmetry, had to practice self-imposed restraint. Perestroika was not designed to be enforced by power means, and the question is what other means were they and how were they used? Other studies have focused on the reaction in the GDR, Alexandra Nepitz, for example, of course, on the German question, path to unification, Soviet foreign policies towards Germany. In general, there are too many important works and authors to mention here. Yet I see my research interest as in one aspect of the Soviet reform period and how it was developed by various participants over time. I look at Perestroika as a multi-level process, which is also the title of my project, a history of communication, and perhaps most important for my general approach, as a period of trying out different ways and of testing of limits. I likewise assume that Perestroika as a new unfolding reality met and challenged people where they were in the Soviet system, and be it at the various levels of diplomatic representations abroad, at support offices and departments. Staff members were dealing with day-to-day business, managed contacts and contracts, applications or properties, and even on 9th and 10th November 1989, for example, there were applications from Berlin, Hohenschönhausen, and Hellersdorf for naming schools after Soviet heroes, if nothing else had happened. At the same time, these staff members were also periodically assessing the relations with the local population and reporting on current developments. A typical file of those that I was given to see, I must always add, especially in this archive, a typical file was therefore the one of 1987 that consisted of translated East and West German newspaper articles concerning the 750th anniversary of Berlin and other topics, of some issues of individual GDR citizens, by themselves interesting but not for the question here, as well as of several informatia, including one from the GDR embassy on, quote, the relationship in the GDR to the internal reform course in the USSR. I will summarize this informatio of 2nd June in the following, as it is fairly representative of others in this earlier period up to the end of 1987. The author of the informatio was this time a third secretary of the embassy, and he described how lectures by Soviet speakers before GDR audiences were restricted, which became especially visible when only 30 to 50 people were allowed in places that would have held 300 to 400 and more people in these assembly places. According to the author, the German friends, by whom he obviously meant, and so did the other informatio, the German friends were the higher echelons of the GDR, they attached particular importance to their reasonings why they saw no need for perestroika reforms. In the population, however, he said there was a 90 to 95% in domestic issues. Perestroika, quote, obviously acts as a catalyst for the social-political activity of GDR citizens, end of quote. For example, a building combined director from Frankfurt-Oder had stated that the majority of those present at a meeting did not support the official SED line. However, quote, they did not know how to provide the necessary support to the government of the Republic, end of quote. According to the informatio, most people in the GDR had only fragmentary ideas of the changes going on in the Soviet Union. They hardly knew Gorbachev's speeches and derived their knowledge from interpretations through West German mass media only. Part of the population, said another informatio of November 1987, had Jesma smutnie, this is completely chaotic, ideas of the processes in the USSR. This was a common topical interpretation in these documents. Indifference and arrogance at state levels, but interest and sympathy among the ordinary and especially the young people, and as you can see from other informatio, also in the provinces and not the capital of Berlin. The informatio also echoed how GDR citizens expressed their concerns about the fate and future of perestroika. Quote, what was the state of health of Mikhail Gorbachev? Would he be able to prevail and see it all through? Was there a guarantee that the reforms would not wither or dry out? How significant was the opposition? This and other informatio stated that people wanted to see real results. This is something really insisted upon in the informatio, maybe as a hint also to the own government. Real results, be they good or bad. Some, especially the older GDR citizens, were said to be expressing doubts about the usefulness of such major changes in the USSR and the actuality or realnost of the tasks ahead. They asked, how can we help the Soviet government? But also, how weaponized is the Soviet Union? While this latter question could be interpreted in two ways, meaning also how threatening is the USSR, others were formulated in apparent favor of the Soviet bigger brother. Quote, how can a general German mood be prevented? Was a question from Magdeburg, especially if it should become, quote, necessary to resort to the army. And how justified was it to change the election system if this might curb the leading role of the CPSU or raise anti-state or anti-socialist elements? Altogether, the June informatio of 87 concluded from the questions that the reform and democratization course in the USSR evoked sympathy among the majority of GDR citizens, and this, quote from the informatio, this helps the Soviet leadership to increase its authority, end of quote. Recommendations to be heeded by the Soviet speakers were also provided in this as well as in other documents, but this is just quoted from the one. Firstly, it was recommended as desirable for propaganda to have an explanatory character, phrases that could give rise to accusations of imposing Soviet position should be avoided. Rather, the audiences should be convinced by visible results, which the speakers should tell them about in free speech or in lively speech. Second, but it was never said what results they were. In no document there is any concrete example. Secondly, the necessity of perestroika should be explained out of the historical development conditions of the USSR, but the focus should also be on the hitherto positive resonance abroad. The problem of picking up on this or that Soviet phenomenon in other socialist countries should be ignored, if possible. Thirdly, the difficulties of the first phase of perestroika should not be dramatized, but one should neither be afraid to speak of them. It should be shown convincingly that the opposition to perestroika was not political in nature and did not represent an insurmountable obstacle. Fourthly, it should be shown that we have used and will use GDR experiences in perestroika for administrative methods, ways of material incentivization, etc. Speakers should emphasize that the exchange of experience between brother states and parties was necessary and natural. Finally, the reinforcement of Western propaganda was driving a wedge between the USSR and the GDR by picking up on the peculiarities of the adoption of the perestroika course in the Republic, meaning assumedly that there was no such picking up. And under the conditions of the GDR, the qualified defense against insinuations by Western mass media regarding the ongoings in the USSR gained particular importance. The aim, as the recommendation said, the aim was unity and the construction of communist society. Such this Informatio of 87, a Referentura file of 1989 listed inquiries into the political questions that arose in the GDR between February and December of that year. These included the response of the GDR populations to the meeting with Honecker, the mood among workers in Leipzig and Karl-Marx-Stadt, demographic developments, and the willingness to leave the GDR, as well as other, of course, burning or current topics. I would like to summarize at this point with some following remarks. Firstly, the meetings at which Soviet speakers appeared were not mentioned here by name. Obviously, there were such meetings. They were very often organized by the DSF, the Deutsch-Sowjetische Freundschaft. Katharina Kuhn has written a dissertation about this organization and also about those meetings, but on the basis of files from the Bundesarchiv in Germany. And these were especially meetings that took place, but others too, in which members, officers talked about at worker assemblies at various places about what perestroika was and what Soviet foreign policies were and so on. And I have a lengthy eyewitness account of one of the Soviet speakers, a translator, a low-level army officer who spoke German, and he told me about the difficulties and anxieties of participants at these meetings, and he's speaking about the anxieties on the Soviet side, because this informer told me that they did not really know what perestroika was and how much they could say and how they should say, because they were afraid that they would get where they would get trouble on both sides, on the GDR side, but also from their superiors in the Soviet Union, if they said too much or if they said the wrong thing. But if you read the Informatio, they always sound as if their authors had fully embraced the reform course, although one must add they do not give the required examples, the good or bad results of perestroika, and speak only in very general and abstract terms, but the way you read them, they have fully embraced what was going on in the Soviet Union. Perestroika was a good thing. It was a model for, in this case, the GDR. And a second observation is the attitude that emerges from the documents, which seem to be very restrained indeed, if not defensive. What I said in the beginning, that perestroika should not be implemented by means of power or force, seems to have been if at all ostentatiously taken to heart by these staff members in the diplomatic service. This is how they wrote their informatio to the places where they were required. Overall, the contents of the files are primarily of an informative nature, of course. They quoted people what they had said in their original, not language, it was all translated into Russian, but they translated what they had said. And conspicuous remarks made by GDR citizens are quoted in the original style, which was, of course, common for diplomatic reports. But you also find this in the reports that came from the press agencies or the others that I saw, the Komsomol. So the authors of these documents seem to have accepted perestroika as a viable exemplary model for foreign countries, and at least in their documents, what they wrote did not question it. And this is a positive attitude towards perestroika, democratization, and glasnost. At the time, in the press agency reports, one can also see how it was meant to be made operational, how one should approach GDR journalists, and so on. This should be kept in mind, I think, when studying this period, and especially at a time when the Gorbachev reforms are now being disparaged today in the aftermath. Thank you.